You're listening to the best, the bravest. Interviews with the FDNY's elite. The 42nd volume of this miniseries, or the Jackie Robinson volume, or Mariano Rivera volume, if you're a baseball fan, of course. Nice to have you with us tonight for episode 260 as well, another milestone episode of the Mike the New Haven podcast. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, that was volume 2, Derek Jeter volume, of course, more baseball references of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide, with current MTA Police Chief and former Yonkers Police Commissioner John Mueller. Really interesting guy, started with the NYPD, transferred to Yonkers, and currently is leading the MTA Police, which is unique because it's like the Port Authority Police in that it's responsible for not one but two states, New York and Connecticut, and the transit lines in place in both states in numerous areas. So very good speaking with the chief, and it'll be good speaking with another chief on the fire department side tonight. We do have a couple sponsors, though, to take care of before I get to them. And first things first, speaking of the fire service, electric vehicles, and specifically fires involving them, are on the rise, and Scott Saul has an app for that. As electric vehicles become a more frequent sight on the roadways these days, it's important to know what to do in the event that they catch fire. And for firefighters responding to electric vehicle fires, immediate information at that, is imperative. It's a must-have, which is where Scott Saul comes in, because he's created the First Responders EV Rescue app. Again, the First Responders Electric Vehicle Rescue app, which provides on-scene information immediately to safely approach and work on an electric or hybrid vehicle that's caught fire. The more information firefighters have, and the quicker they have it for these type of emergencies, the better. And you can get this app on the Apple App Store, of course, if you have an iPhone, or if you have any other device, mainly an Android. You can get it on Google Play if you go there. What this app does is unique because it not only includes the location of the first, second, and third batteries in an electric vehicle, it also tells you about high voltage fuel cells and cables, ultra high strength steel, jacking and stabilization points, and cable cut areas, and also where you shouldn't cut in the event that you need to extricate somebody out the vehicle. And lastly, high voltage disconnects. So again, that's the EV Rescue app, First Responders EV Rescue app, which you can get on the App Store if you have an iPhone, and Google Play for an Android. Scott Saul created it. He's based out of Deer Park, New York, and this provides immediate information to firefighters responding to electric vehicle fires. Much thanks to Scott, who's a fireman out in Deer Park in Long Island. And from that, we go to an NYPD friend and one of the co-executive producers and creators of a miniseries we have on the show, I should say, Tales from the Boom Room, profiling retired members of the NYPD bomb squad. He was a detective in the NYPD, like I said, and he's still a detective technically in the private sector, and that's Bill Ryan. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the Elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson and Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike to New Haven podcast. Special thanks to both Scott and Bill for taking care of me sponsor-wise. Last note, of course, there's Super Chat and the Super Thanks if you see this later, but if you want to contribute the Super Chat tonight, I would appreciate it. All right, sponsors taken care of. My next guest is a retired 34-year veteran of the fire service, specifically with the New York City Fire Department. He's a child of Brooklyn. He worked in his home borough. He worked in the Bronx, too, and Manhattan, and retired at the rank of Deputy Chief back in 2015, and that for this volume 42 of the Best, the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite is retired FDNY Deputy Chief Tom Dunne. Chief, welcome. How are you?
Thank you, Mike. Good evening. Thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you.
Pleasure to have you. So like I said in the introduction, child of Brooklyn, I believe. Which part of Brooklyn did you grow up in?
Well, I grew up in the Greenpoint section of Brooklyn, which is right next to Williamsburg. It was a very different neighborhood when I was a child there. Greenpoint and Williamsburg have been gentrified tremendously, but it was a fun community for a kid to grow up in. When I was there, it was largely a blue-collar community, but we lived on the streets. We played ball on the streets from dawn to dusk, and it was really kind of a cool experience growing up in New York City.
I imagine. Was there family on the job? Was your father on the job or an uncle?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, my dad was a New York City firefighter. He did 29 years. He eventually retired as a lieutenant. And for a number of years, when he was a firefighter, he worked in an engine company that was in our own neighborhood. So I had an opportunity early on to visit the firehouse to see my dad. And periodically, I even saw him responding on the back step of the truck when he used to ride the back step. And a couple of times got to watch him work at different jobs.
Which is something that I imagine inspired you to go into the fire service. You know, there's a family tradition there, of course, and you continued it. Talking with Deputy Chief Tom Dunne for Volume 42, the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. To all you tuning in the live chat via YouTube or LinkedIn, I appreciate you. I don't want to shout you out, not because I don't care, I do care, but because I'm afraid I might miss somebody, then I'll feel bad about it. But thank you all for being here. I see all you, and I appreciate it. So getting into the Rock, as Randall's Island is called at that time, you know, and still is to this day, of course. Very difficult. You know, this is as it should be, right? You want to make sure you're breeding the best firefighters. How nerve-wracking an experience was that? Because listen, you want to make your dad proud. You want to get on the job.
Yeah.
You passed the test. That was the first step. Now you got to pass the physical portion of it. So again, how nerve-wracking was it? And what helped you calm down and focus?
Well, obviously, it's competition. Back when I was taking the test, there typically were 25 to 30,000 applicants, and you took the written test, and then there was a physical component, and then you had to get through the investigation and such. When I finally got on the job, naturally, I was thrilled. My dad was very happy for me. He was very relieved to see that I became a firefighter. In all honesty, even though I admired my dad and I admired that type of work and saw it as a very exciting experience, initially, and I pointed this out in the book I wrote, I didn't see it as a lifelong career. I went in with the mentality that I wanted to experience it for about a year just to see what it was like to be a New York City firefighter and then move on with my life and then do something else. And obviously, what happened was I jumped into the job, fell in love with it, wound up doing over 3 decades. So that initial feeling of going to what they call Proby School, the Rock on Randall's Island, I was very excited. There's a lot of adrenaline popping. It wasn't initially entirely what I expected. I kind of knew that there would be a lot of physicality and firefighting evolutions, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Um, Although the New York City Fire Department in particular is a quasi-military institution, and I was more of a free spirit type of mindset. So initially, first couple of days, you're lined up, you're marching, and after a few hours of that, I'm thinking, what has this got to do with firefighting? So it took me a little while to adapt to the quasi-military structure of the job, and certainly there was a reason for that. But as far as the Rock, I can't say I enjoyed every aspect of it, but I loved the physicality of it. I loved the hands-on working with the tools, climbing the aerial, doing the rope slide off the building. Initially taking feeds. I don't think they still do this, but one part of your training was you had to go into the smokehouse, remove your face piece, and wind up singing a song just to experience what it's like to take some smoke in the event that your face piece malfunctions or heaven forbid you run out of air. So it was a good experience. It changed my perspective quite a bit, and as I said, um, I quickly developed a passion for the job, and it became my life's work rather than just something that I anticipated I would do for a relatively short period.
And I think what's interesting, and I've covered this before with guys that came on the job in the 70s and in the 80s, is in your case, 1981, is that your instructors back then were probably Vietnam War veterans on top of being New York City firefighters, or probably even Korean War veterans on top of being New York City firefighters. And they just lived through the war years, which was the 60s and the 70s, and when fire was enveloping the city at an all time high. So to call them experienced, to call them salty, if you will, is an understatement. And looking back, I mean, what a blessing, what a privilege that must have been to have those specific firefighters of that particular era teaching you.
Absolutely. I was broken in by a friend of mine referred to them as the Babe Ruths of the fire service.
Mm.
These were guys who were, in many cases, were Korean War veterans, Vietnam veterans, in some cases. In many cases, they were guys who had worked in parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn where literally they would go from fire to fire, and it was not unusual for them to have 20 or more structural fires per night, where they would just literally leave one building, maybe go to the next block over and attack the next fire. And to be around people who experienced that level of firefighting was a blessing, to really pick these guys' minds and get a sense of what they learned and what they showed us as new employees of the FDNY.
So you get into, I believe originally, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ladder 24, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, originally I was assigned to a engine company in Queens, where I caught some work, learned the basics of engine work, but I was the kind of guy who always wanted to learn and diversify things. So I was very tempted to go to Manhattan to experience Midtown and to learn truck work. So after I broke in initially as a probie in the Queens Engine Company, I put a transfer request in. Fortunately, wound up getting Ladder 24, which was a good, aggressive Midtown truck company, West 31st Street. Spent several years there, and that was again, a really great learning experience. I worked with some incredible people in that particular company, and I always felt that if you're going to be in the FDNY, regardless of what rank you seek to achieve or what borough you prefer to eventually wind up in, I always thought you were kind of missing something if you didn't experience Manhattan. That it was just a really unique environment, a really unique fire challenge, and I picked up an awful lot working in 24 truck.
The line that I always go back to is David Weiss from Rescue One, who perished on 9/11. Sadly,
Yeah.
he was featured in the Bravest, and one thing that he was talking about when they were interviewing him on the program was that, and this is his words, I'm paraphrasing, you can't beat the action in Manhattan. The fires, the buildings, with all the emergencies that they may present, collapse scenarios, or workers getting stuck up there. In his words, it's tops. And he was right then. And all these years later, he's still correct in saying that. And I believe Ladder 24 is right by Madison Square Garden. So as I covered with Ray McCormack, rather, another veteran of Ladder 24 in his own right, you're not only dealing with fires, there's potential for MVAs, because not just with the sheer amount of car traffic in that area, you get a lot of foot traffic there too.
Yeah, it was a very congested area. It's right down the block. As you spoke to Ray, was a great guy I worked with in 24 truck. Right down the block from Penn Station, you had Macy's, the Empire State Building, a real curious mix of high-rise work, commercial work, and on the west side, a number of tenements. So we caught some tenement work. And at the time I was there, in fact, when I was working with Ray, two of the really large hotels that we were first due at essentially were probably about 30 or more stories high, and they were putting poor people. They were welfare clients at that point, so they were being put in there in these buildings. Not the greatest conditions for them, as individuals. We caught a fair amount of work there, so we even got to see that aspect of see these unfortunate individuals who didn't have any income or very little income and lived in horrendous conditions. And you got to see that side of life too in 24 truck. So two things that come to mind always in that particular company: forcible entry skills. If you're going to learn forcible entry, that was the place to learn it. When you looked at the variety of locks that you had to wind up overcoming. And the second thing would really be the size of the buildings. When you wind up working out in the boroughs, it could be very challenging going to taxpayers, tenement work, stuff like that. But the buildings in Midtown were enormous, and you had to be really careful in smoke condition. Just finding the location of the fire, just when you're doing a search, making sure that you kept your awareness of exactly where you were and that you were in a position to find your way out if you got in too deeply. So it was a good learning experience.
Oh, I can imagine. And, that size up process begins before the call even comes in. The
Yeah.
better you understand these buildings, as you alluded to, the makeups of them, rather it be going over the blueprints, rather it be doing building inspection, as is commonplace in the fire service, especially in the FDNY, the better it's going to be when that inevitable call comes in. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a fire. If there's a scenario where there's a medical call, and the person in the building is located in an area that's relatively difficult to get to, knowing the size of the building can even help in that capacity. So it's a lot to process, but it really, and this is no disrespect to the other boroughs, each boroughs present different challenges,
Right.
but it's really the place, like you said, to learn how to firefight in different aspects outside of, well, fighting fires.
Absolutely. Uh, it's seldom you could do, well, you never really could do a 360 size up. Maybe you could see the front of the building if you had access to an alley, maybe two sides of a building. So size up was a challenge due to the structural layout of mid Manhattan and certainly the size of the buildings. There was and is a certain energy to Manhattan that you don't see elsewhere. That there are people in the streets all times of the night. Some really good people, some people that are, you want to stay away from. Uh, you occasionally ran into some interesting runs in mid Manhattan experiences that you wouldn't have in the other boroughs. And again, one that comes to mind just right now. I remember we went out often. Obviously, most of firefighters' work is emergencies, and we don't go to fires all the time. We go to enough fires, but probably emergencies make up the majority of our responses and our work. And I do remember getting called out in the middle of the night one time in the winter, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, and we're all exhausted because it was a busy night for what was a steam leak. And we go down towards the Chelsea area on the west side. Again, it's 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. I can barely keep my eyes open at that point. And there's a lady standing in front of this little tenement, this apartment house on the stoop, waving us down. And I look at her. Okay, what's the problem, lady? Well, I got a steam leak. All right, let's go upstairs to your steam leak. We go upstairs, and she had steam radiator where the pressure valve had either blown off or fallen off, and all you had to do was close, the valve to shut off the steam. And we were in and out in a couple of minutes, and she thanked us profusely. She was a really nice lady. And as we're walking downstairs, my lieutenant says to me, "That was Whoopi Goldberg." And at the time, I didn't know who she was. Maybe this was early in her career. So I said, "Who's Whoopi Goldberg, and how come she can't turn off a radiator?" So you end up running into the occasional celebrity or sports person. Occasionally you could see a boxer walking down the block, heading to Madison Square Garden. So there was, aside from the firefighting aspect of Manhattan, there was kind of that energy that you experience being in Manhattan.
Hey, listen, the Knicks and Rangers are there too. So one night you might see Patrick Ewing, one night you might see Brian Leach,
Yeah,
casually
right.
walking down the
That's
street,
right.
since of course they're in close proximity as well. And that's the beauty of it, right? I mean, again, you never know what's going to happen. And I guess we can talk about fires specifically in this instance because it doesn't necessarily have to be a high rise on the 58th floor. It can be anything. A lot of construction's happening too. Sometimes those materials can catch a blaze. So is there a notable fire of any sort? Doesn't have to be a four alarm, but just something that stuck out to you early on in your career from that time?
As I think about that, there were so many that they almost blend together, but there is one that sticks in my mind for a couple of reasons. And this was, I can still see the building. It was a 5-story building. It was probably uh, combined about 4 or 5 or 6 old tenements that were incorporated into one residential structure, 5 stories high. Um, and I remember this for a couple of reasons. First of all, I came to work for a night tour and I wasn't feeling that well. In fact, I had a pretty bad cold. So I'm sitting at home and I'm thinking, geez, if I go sick, it's not like a job where you just call in sick and say, I'll be in tomorrow. It doesn't work like that. If you go sick because in my case, I had a cold, you can't go back to work until you go to the medical office and the medical doctor checks you out and authorizes you to go back to work. I don't want to bother with that. So I remember driving down to work thinking, all right, it's a cold. I know I feel run down. What the heck? How bad could it be? And the tour went okay until again, is it the Peter principle? When something bad can happen, it happens again about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. We get called to what turned out to be a fifth alarm fire in this building. And at the time, I was the OV, which is the outside vent person. My job was essentially to climb the aerial in this case to the top floor with the saw to start helping them open up cut the roof up there. And now I remember going up the aerial up to the roof, and I got, the axe and the halligan in my left hand. I got the roof saw over my shoulder. And by the time I get up the roof, I am wiped out. I mean, I can barely work. Um, and as I start working up in the roof, starting to do my roof cuts, I'll never forget there was a scuttle opening and a firefighter pops his head up. And he says there's a good smoke condition on the top floor. And he says there's a firefighter dying down here. And like right away, I'm thinking, oh, geez, how bad is this going to get? And I remember they needed assistance to help get this guy out. So I remember the feeling of going down the scuttle ladder and there's zero visibility. And I'm not the only one. There's a couple of the firefighters down there. And I'm groping around in the smoke, trying to figure out what's going on. And I come across this firefighter leaning over like this. And I'm thinking, geez, this got to be the guy. This must be the guy that's dying. And I remember going over to him and getting him in this big bear hug. And I'm thinking, I don't know what I'm going to do with him because I'm only average size. I'm 170. This guy had to be 200. And to drag him up and take him up a vertical scuttle ladder is going to be impossible. Yet I'm thinking, I got to do something. I'm not going to leave this guy here. And as I'm got my arms around him and I got my face piece on and he's got his face piece on, we could barely hear each other, but I hear this guy screaming, it's not me. It's not me. He's saying it's not me. And what he was doing, he was actually leaning over the guy who was unconscious, the firefighter who apparently had taken a bad feed and was the reason for the rescue. So as it turned out, someone on the roof threw a rope down the scuttle. They tied him off. They pulled him up, and he was rescued. And I remember that for two reasons. Number one, I remember, the almost trauma of going down there and try to help out this guy in whatever way I could. But the irony of that particular job was the fella that they rescued, we tied him up with a rope. They pulled him up to the roof and he survived and he lived, right? His son, about 25 years later, when I was a deputy chief up in the Bronx, he made some really nice rescues at one of my fires. So it was like a father-son thing. And I felt like, wow, that's such a great ironic sense of completion that I played a little part in rescuing his dad. And now 25 years later, as a firefighter, one of my firefighters in the Bronx, he's stepping up and helping me in one of my incidents. And that particular incident, again, was an apartment house where there were 12 1045s on the top floor. The 1045 in New York City Fire Department means the victim. These were unconscious, about 12 civilians who were actually on the top floor and were trying to get up a stairway to the bulkhead to get out of the smoke. And because there was a locked gate there, they all passed out. And this guy, the son of the guy that I was involved in East 22nd Street, was the guy who got down that stairway, forced that gate open, and helped rescue all those people. So it's almost like balancing points of my career. And probably if I were to pick one job from my years in 24 truck, that would probably be the one that sticks in my memory.
Oh my goodness, that's the highlight of the show right there. I often put highlight clips out the next day. That's a top-notch story. I think that's one of the favorite stories I've heard because it came full circle. As you just said, that's really a full circle moment in the fire service.
It brought in the father-son aspect of the job that I experienced, that so many people experience, and just a sense of like the circle of life completing.
Right.
I helped him, he helped me.
Yeah. You know what? Usually in the rapid fire, and you saw it in my outline, and the audience knows this, I always ask most uplifting job you responded to. You just answered it. It doesn't get much more uplifting than that, right?
I had one other as a captain that, if we have time, we'll talk about.
We'll talk about it in the rapid fire.
That was pretty uplifting.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good. At least there's another one. So by 1991, when Ray McCormack, Kevin Shea, and Patty Brown made that roof rope rescue, had you gone out to 51 truck by then?
Yes. At that point, when Ray was involved in that rescue, I had been promoted to lieutenant. I was working in the Bronx. Mm-hmm. I remember seeing that and thinking, wow, that Kevin Shea was the fella at the end of the rope. Mm-hmm. They all did a great job. I don't know if you ever had the opportunity to meet Kevin Shea. I see him yearly out in Indianapolis at FDIC, and he is the most classy guy on the planet.
Yes,
You
he
look at
is.
him, you'd have no idea of the things that he's accomplished. A very humble, very decent guy, but all of Rescue One obviously was involved in that. And yeah, at the time that they accomplished that great move, I was working in the Bronx at that time.
Bruce Newberry was involved in that job too. Kevin's supposed to be on the show next Tuesday to
Oh,
talk
good.
about the Union Square incident of 1991. He's supposed to be one of the panelists involved for that, trying to work out the details, but he should be here hopefully. So I guess we can go back for a second and talk about rank ascension. Anytime I interview a police guest or a fire guest, I talk about this because, and it's funny, I was having a conversation earlier. I'm not a fireman myself, but I work as an administrative assistant at a fire department here in Connecticut, in West Haven. And as I was having lunch, sitting next to me was one of our deputy chiefs. And I asked him, I says, Chief, in your career, you've been on the job about 40 years. What is your favorite rank? And he says, firefighter. He enjoyed it the most. But even though fire officers are needed, he said that. Not that he doesn't like his current rank, but looking at his full career, he likes everything from each rank, but that he felt was his best one. And you're not necessarily responsible for a crew of guys. It's scary that way when you have to be responsible for not only yourself, but their safety too. But nevertheless, that leap is important from a knowledge standpoint. You get to share it, you get to advance your own career as well in the process. So it's a double win. When did you first have an idea? You know what? Maybe I do want to shoot for the lieutenant's test. Maybe I do want to move up the ladder.
It came gradually. Um, I loved being a firefighter. In fact, I would say, geez, if I had to pick a favorite rank, I'd be tempted to say firefighter. Maybe ultimately, deputy chief became my favorite rank, although initially it was my least favorite rank, in all honesty. Uh, I think it came gradually because I always had, from the beginning, a very strong academic interest in the job. So I did a lot of reading and studying. I felt the more I knew, the more I wanted to know. So I would try to learn the job, try to study many aspects of the job just to learn. And then I kind of gradually evolved into the study for promotion process. And part of that is, although I love being a firefighter, I looked at my officers, and I had some great officers in Ladder 24. And I saw that as a new challenge because I had never been anyone's boss,
Right.
and I thought this is tough work to begin with. Imagine being the person who not only does the work, but supervises five or more people and has to make initial quick decisions, not only for yourself, but for the safety of these four or five people that you're responsible for. So I think, although I like being a firefighter, um, I think I gradually, as a firefighter, started to evolve to a point where I wanted to continue to challenge myself. I always wanted to challenge myself to the next level, and that's essentially how that came about. And again, if you know the details of the promotion process in the FDNY, it's very, very involved. It's not like one book. You have shelves of books that you have to put almost to memory, and then get involved in very competitive promotional exams. But that was kind of my mindset. I evolved from a guy who loved being a firefighter, who tried to learn all I could, to a guy who loved being a firefighter, who wanted to take it up to the next supervisory challenge.
And this is another full circle moment, much like we talked about earlier with the rescue we were able to make, and then how that turned out 25 years later. This is your dad's rank. And this is a rank I imagine he held for quite a long time. So if he was still around at this point in your career, if you were able to lean on him for advice at all, what did he tell you if those conversations occurred?
Well, I didn't. I asked him a lot when I was going to become a firefighter, and he would advise me of things. I remember something my dad said before I became a firefighter, because I had never been a volunteer. I was coming in brand new as someone who never experienced fire. And I remember as a firefighter, he told me a lot of things. One of the things he told me was, you're going to be in smoke, you're going to feel like you're lost. Don't be afraid to turn around and say, Latitude 4, where are you? Because they may be 2 feet from you. You just can't see them. When I became a lieutenant, um, there wasn't too much he wanted to tell me at that point, but I could tell he had this tremendous excitement that I was going to go along the same sort of path that he did. The promotional ceremony at Randall's Island at the Rock, Uh, when I got promoted, there were a lot of guys. We probably had upwards of 50 or 60 or more guys promoted to lieutenant that day. And I remember my dad and mom were in the audience watching the promotion, and they would announce your name and they would give you your assignment, whatever battalion you initially were assigned to. And I remember my dad had a piece of paper and a pencil, and he wrote down the battalion that I was assigned to, and you just see the excitement in him. It was almost like he was going back 20 years to when he got promoted. So he was really proud, and happy to see me go through that. The whole leap to lieutenant for me was not easy. And I kind of learned it step by step with the help of a lot of firefighters who stepped up and guided me.
And it's interesting because I was talking about this with Lou Refrano, who's a friend of mine. I work for him. He has his own show called Getting Salty, which focuses on retired members of the fire service, mainly the FDNY. And Lou was a lieutenant for a long time in Engine 290, Truck 103 in Brooklyn, and also
Right.
Squad 288 in SOC. And the funny thing that he talked about is when you first became a lieutenant, generally speaking, or become a lieutenant, I should say, there's that moment where you realize, oh, the buck stops with me in this
Yeah.
particular incident. They're looking at me asking, what
Yeah.
should we do? When there might be some scenarios early on as a lieutenant where you're wondering, what do we do?
Yeah.
But gradually, the more situations you're faced with, the more comfortable you can get. And that's why I like the way the FDNY does it, to where once you get promoted initially to lieutenant, you're not immediately given a permanent command. Circumstances have been different. I know after 9/11, circumstances were a tad different for very obvious reasons. But normally, you're given a myriad of assignments as a UFO, which for those of you who don't know, I believe it stands for Until Further Orders. And
Right.
that's where you learn. And that's a good thing because you don't want to thrust them right away into a new command. Hey, I'm your new boss. No, let's ease you in. Let's get you up to speed on how this works. And then when you're comfortable, or if you've ascertained enough experience, then we can give you a permanent command.
Exactly. Exactly. And there's the what they call the bouncing process, where you're bouncing throughout the city, and you wind up being in neighborhoods that you never would be in, and facing scenarios that you normally wouldn't see. I got to work basically in every borough when I was bouncing around, uh, meeting different people, meeting hundreds and hundreds of firefighters, and two things come to mind in that experience. One thing that made it easier, that makes it easier, is that if you're in Staten Island or Manhattan or Queens or wherever you are, uh, there are set procedures. So obviously, a high-rise district is somewhat different, but for the most part, you're going to fight a fire in Queens in the same way you're going to fight a fire in the Bronx. So the procedures being universal help you quite a bit as a new person as you're bouncing around.
Mm.
And the second thing that helps is that the firefighters, 99.9% of them, always stepped up and helped me. I seldom had a problem with an employee. I really did. That I would come in, I was green, they knew it. They helped me quite a bit. I'd have to say that really at every rank, my firefighters carried me through a lot of difficult things. So the process was like that. You bounce around, you gradually get more and more comfortable with the position. Um, Two things I had to get comfortable with, and I think this is a general rule for anyone who is on the verge of getting promoted, regardless of what department you're in. One is I like to call it learning to pull the trigger. All right. You can't be, especially as the first due officer, you can't be passive and think, well, when a more experienced guy comes in, he's going to decide what we're going to do. No, you're the first due engine. All right. You see something, pull the trigger. If you think it's a second alarm situation, give the second alarm. If you size it up and you feel, in this case, maybe it's a frame building that's burning to a point where you want to initially make a decision not to do an interior attack and tell you guys stay outside. Let's set up a line and hit it from the outside. And then if this subsequent senior guy or battalion chief comes in and changes the strategy, that's up to him. So you got to be willing to stick your neck out a little bit, make a decision. And the other thing that can be difficult, and I had to learn this too, you have to learn to say no. Sometimes you always want to help your guys in whatever they want to do, or whatever they need. But there are certain times where you just have to say no to people, and everyone wants to be a pleaser. I want to be a pleaser. Uh, as a boss, you're no longer on the back step. You're one of the boys, but you're not any longer truly one of the boys. There are times when you have to say no. And quick story, a learning to say no
Sure,
story, and this
please.
has have to do not even with a firefighter, but with the wife of a firefighter. Right? I'm a lieutenant, and it's payday, and every second Thursday was payday. And nowadays, everyone gets an electronic check. It's deposited electronically. Back then, they would send the bag around with the checks, and the checks would come in up to your office, and guys would come in and get their checks. And guys who weren't working, well, you'd put the checks securely away, and when they would come in, they would get their pay. So one day it's payday. I'm sitting in the office, and the wife of one of my firefighters comes into my office. And I know her pretty well because I've seen her at parties, I've seen her at picnics and things of that nature. And she sits down at my desk and she's on the verge of tears. And I say, what's the matter? What's going on? And she says, his name, her husband, he left me. Oh, geez, I'm so sorry to hear that. I don't have any money. Oh, okay. She wanted his paycheck. And now, what do I do? I'm a relatively new lieutenant. This is one of my guys, but he's not working. This is his wife. I know it's his wife. She's a nice lady. I know her from previous, socialization. I can't give her a check. I can't do that. Legally, I can't do that. Morally, I can't do that. And yet, part of me understands she's upset and she doesn't have any money and they have two kids. And I had to say no. I had to say, geez, I'm sorry. I just am not enabled. I'm not legally or morally allowed to do this. Can you understand that? And she understood and she left. And that guy, a couple of tours later, he comes in and now her husband and I are working this tour together. And I say, hey, his name, your wife was here the other day, and she was pretty upset. She wanted your check. And he looks at me and he says, you could have given it to her. And I felt like smacking the guy. Well, you put me through all this. So, but again, it was a scenario where, and this is not firefighting, it's got to do with leadership and administration and all that stuff. There's times on the fire ground and even off the fire ground where you had to get comfortable with being the man, the person who said no. And that was a learning experience for me. And I think universally, for anyone out there who's a new officer, regardless of where you are, uh, probably a challenge that most people would run into occasionally.
And whatever the deed, good, bad, or indifferent, the common theme is this: you will have to answer for it at some point. So even if you do have the okay to give the check, legally, it's not allowed. Morally, ethically, of course, you said you wouldn't do it and you stuck by those guns, and that's good. But by the letter of the law, if for whatever reason the financial documents came out, somebody did an audit, this member did not get their check for this week. How do you explain that?
Yeah,
Even if you can understand the situation, still, it's not easy to have to answer for it, which is why it's always better, even if it kills you emotionally to do it in the moment, to follow the letter of the law. And,
yeah,
same thing on the fire floor. Even if maybe he might be able to stretch that line. Maybe he might be able to force that door, but the situation's getting too dangerous. Better that we pull out and he's mad at me and I'm carrying his casket.
absolutely. The decision, often the decision to say we're going defensive, we're not going to do an interior attack, is not going to be a popular decision. And once in a while, you had to make it as a company officer. Fairly often, you had to make it as a chief officer. Most of the time, it's not a popular decision because firefighters are like that. We can get it. I can get it, chief. Give me another 2 minutes, I'll knock it down. And that's where the professionalism comes in, where you step back and say, no, from my perception as in this case, the incident commander looking at it from the street, I don't get a good gut reaction about where this fire is going. Firefighting is not a democracy. It's not. There's someone in charge, the incident commander, whether he's the initial company officer or the deputy chief or whoever is on scene, he carries the moral and emotional weight of knowing that every decision I make affects not only me but the lives and safety of everyone who's working underneath me, and that takes some getting used to. You talk about the loneliness of command. And I experienced that quite a bit when I wound up becoming a deputy chief, that you turn around and it's you. There's no one there advising you. You have to accept the responsibility.
Let's go back for a moment, if you will, to just focusing strictly on your time in 51. You see Ladder 24. The motto there is Midtown Madness, right? For the reasons that we discussed earlier. And like I've joked about many times before with FDNY guests that have come on this program previously, it's essentially fire departments merged into one because each, as I said, each borough presents different challenges. What you're doing out in Staten Island might be dramatically different from what you're doing out in Queens. And here you are going from Midtown Manhattan to Eastchester out in the Bronx.
Yeah.
So getting out there, tell me about the common emergencies out there and getting used to how that specific company did things compared to 24.
It was a different environment. Midtown, obviously congested, a lot of high rise work. When I got up to the Bronx, that this particular area of the northeast Bronx, uh, while there was high rise public housing, like you'd have the 20, 25-story fire resistive apartment houses that were high rise fires and that could be very challenging. Much of the work was 1, 2-story frame private dwellings. Much of the work was that taxpayer. There wasn't that much taxpayer work, at least when I was working in mid Manhattan. There was more up in the northern part of Manhattan, but we didn't get a heck of a lot of taxpayer work in my particular area. I don't know if that was, the neighborhood, or just, maybe I had a white cloud follow me around of taxpayer work. But I started experiencing taxpayer jobs. 51 truck was a tower ladder. 24 truck was a rear mount, so that's an aerial ladder. So even there was a difference there. We would be special called sometimes as a tower ladder. We would be supplied by an engine, set up the tower ladder. We might be, working, applying a exterior stream, a master stream onto a fire for hours and hours in all kinds of weather. So there was that change. The intricacies of truck work don't change. The forcible entry, the positioning of the five firefighters, the OV, the roof man, the can man, that's universal. That pretty much stays the same. Um, what I had to get a little bit used to, the nature of the neighborhood was different. It was at times a dangerous neighborhood. There was a great deal of drug activity in that neighborhood, and it was a shame because, again, I don't know, 97, 98% of the people who lived there were just decent people. They went to work, they did what they had to do, but there was that 1 or 2 or 3% that were always in the street. They were always like causing trouble, in their case, dealing drugs. Um, that was different. I didn't run into that much criminal type of atmosphere in Midtown. I really didn't. And the work was more regular. I got more actual fire duty in the Bronx over time. It was just a busier borough in that sense. There was just a lot more fire activity. And I had really one of my most unusual and unique experiences at a fire in the Bronx. One that sticks in my, again, you ask about significant fires in your career. In March of 1990, I was actually working a night tour in a different truck company. I must have been working overtime. And I got called to the Happy Lands fire, which was, actually something like 50 years to the day of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and 87 people unfortunately died at the nightclub. And I have images of being there seared in my brain, of seeing, in this case, was all very young people in this nightclub. Um, and they were just, most of them weren't even burned, just like they all had fallen asleep. And that was a unique experience that, to this day I can kind of visualize. And that was, you know of structural fires where there were fatalities, that was absolutely the worst. But the Bronx was a great place for a firefighter to work. It really was. It kind of balanced out the Midtown experience. It diversified the things I had seen, the things I was capable of doing.
And if the Warriors were over, certainly during that time, nobody told the Bronx that because the
Yeah,
Bronx was still very much burning during this time frame. Part of it was crime, part of it was still arson being very prevalent, not necessarily for people trying to get into better living situations, as was commonplace during the 60s and 70s, or corrupt landlords, drug dealers fighting with each other, anything. In this case, a jilted lover was the reason for Happy Lands, which
yes,
unfortunately claimed as many lives as it did.
yes.
But anything, they refer to the helmets of Bronx firefighters as having a Bronx bend. It's unique in that it's seen so many different types of fires. And
Although if you go to Brooklyn, they'll call it the Brooklyn Bend. It's the same bend, I guess, a
yep,
different.
different boroughs, of course. And again, such a unique borough, especially when you get down to certain parts of just Grand Concourse. You have Yankee Stadium and the surrounding area around that. And it makes for, again, I hate to use the term, but it's a term of endearment. I preface it by saying this: ghetto firefighting. Guys tell you with great pride that they were ghetto firefighters because those neighborhoods in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, were some of the places that you got the best fires that a fireman could ever respond to.
Yes, absolutely. And the Bronx always was, and I believe still is, although it's been revitalized to a great extent, it
Hmm.
was the poorest borough. Again, the people who live there, they didn't have a lot of money, and whatever the reasons are, there's generally a correlation between income level and level of fire activity, and that caused the Bronx experience, in my experience, and certainly if you went back 20 or more years prior to my arriving there, where these guys were going to tenement after tenement fire for a number of reasons.
Hmm.
But yeah, the Bronx was, and at the same time, the Bronx was, you took a certain pride being in the Bronx. I think the Bronx traditionally did not tend to be a rule following borough. It was a little bit, you know, if you could get the job done, get it done. And if you weren't in the proper uniform, it wasn't quite like Midtown where, you had to have the hat on and all that type of thing. The Bronx was a little more free flowing, which was an interesting thing to see. And you did get a sense of a Bronx identity and a certain pride of being a Bronx firefighter.
And apply that to Manhattan. Another great story. Patty O'Keefe told this years ago. I think Paul Hashagen relayed it. Patty O'Keefe, another unfortunately great fireman who perished on 9/11 from Rescue One, and that he's responding to a firefighter with Rescue One, of course, responding to a fire, I should say, as a firefighter with Rescue One. And the woman there, it's at a high rise Manhattan, says, "Can you please take off your boots before you enter?" That's what she's thinking about as her apartment's burning. They put it out. What do? Take off their boots. And Patty O'Keefe says to a firefighter, and I guess is covering that day in one, who looks at him with great confusion upon this. He can't believe what he's hearing. And he says, "Welcome to Manhattan." Or you go out to the Bronx and, as you said, just get in there and get it done. Whatever the case has to be, as
Yeah,
long as you put that fire out and nobody is seriously injured or killed, hey, have at it. And that, I mean, again, this is another term I use lovingly. It's not said with anything but it's cowboy firefighting. Not that it's reckless, but it's what you want. Gung ho within responsibility, of course.
yes, absolutely. And you bring out a good point. There are exceptions certainly, but overall, the nature of the resident in Midtown was somewhat different than the nature of the resident in the Bronx. A Bronx person may, in their own apartment house, have experienced two or three or four fires over the course of the 2 or 3 years they stayed there.
Right.
So, which is unfortunate because these people people went to work, didn't start the fires, but suffered the consequences of it. And they just had a more, I don't know, realistic view of fire and of life. By comparison, I remember, funny story, Thanksgiving Day, I'm working in 24 truck. Thanksgiving Day is known in New York City for food in the stove. A lot of people crank up the oven to get the
Yeah.
turkey. The oven has grease, there's a lot of smoke. We get a run for food in the stove with a group of people, pretty well off people, I think, in their apartment. And they got food in the stove. We turn the oven off, and just the smoke starts to dissipate. They thank us profusely. And as we're leaving, they were from out of town and they asked us, "How much do we owe you?" They thought that they had to write us a check for responding there. So one of our smart aleck guys said, "Well, that'll be $175." And then I said, "No, it doesn't work like that. In New York City, it's a public service." But the people in the Bronx, they they were good people, and I say that most of them were just decent, walking around people who uh, they liked their street life. If you went out at night, if you had to run in the middle of the night in parts of the Bronx, there'd be people out there. There'd be cerveza, there'd be music. There was a liveliness to the
Oh
borough
yeah.
that I actually enjoyed quite a bit.
Oh, of course. It's kind of people say this about Washington Heights, but it's true in the Bronx just as much. And I say this as somebody who's Dominican. It's Dominican Republic Central out there.
Yeah,
It's basically Dominican Republic South when you
yeah,
get out there.
yeah.
And my family's out there too, so I hear what you're saying. And that's why I say earlier that listen, when I said ghetto firefighter, it's a term of pride and endearment and love because they took pride in fighting fires on behalf of those people. They love to
Absolutely.
represent those communities, and you're one of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
And after a while, at first it strikes you as being annoying that the on the fire escape there's a speaker playing loud music. And when we first get there, it's like, what are they doing this for? And then after a couple of years up there, it's like, hey, that's pretty nice. They make it a little louder, make it a little louder.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. So, how long did you have in 51 before you made captain? When did you get promoted to captain?
Geez, I'm trying to I think I was there probably about 3 years.
Hmm.
I was one of those guys that to get promoted, two things have to happen. You have to study, you have to work really hard, and you have to get lucky. The um, the promotional test has to be timed in a way so that you're like riding a wave. So you pass the lieutenant's test. Well, if the captain's test comes along at the right time, you're geared for that. And these tests have to come at a time when there's nothing difficult going on in your life. If your parents getting ill, if you have a new baby or something, if you're working a side job, it gets incredibly hard and distracting and hard to study. And for whatever reason, my test and my outside life influences just all kind of flowed together. So I rapidly went through the ranks from lieutenant to captain to be battalion chief, eventually the deputy chief, in part because I worked really hard. I'd have to say that, but also in part because the tests were timed well for me. And my family life was stable and going good. My wife was working, but she was able to pick up a lot of the childcare, which enabled me to spend more time studying. So I was one of those lucky guys who, I had four lucky Saturdays, as they say. Sat down and wrote the test, and the test came along at the right time. So I would say, in answer to your question, I think it was lieutenant, maybe, it's hard to remember now, maybe 6 years before I made captain, and probably half that time I was in 51 truck.
Hmm. Okay, so well, this is again pretty deep into your career, and this is in the '90s too. And again, this is an interesting time that I think I was having this conversation with somebody off the air. In the history of the FDNY, often gets overlooked. You have the merger with EMS in 1996. Prior to that, though, Howard Safer, when he was commissioner, I got the chance to ask him about this when he was on the show last summer. Right before he became NYPD commissioner, he also instituted CFRD runs. So now, in addition to firefighting and maybe collapse rescue, whatever the case might be, MVA responses, you have medical calls. And when that came in, admittedly, some firefighters went, ugh, why?
Yeah.
But it's proven to be a great thing. So when, yeah, as a fire officer, when that became part of the repertoire of response, tell me about that adjustment to getting your guys equipped to respond to a heart attack, a bleed, pediatric calls.
Well, they didn't mind doing those responses,
Hmm.
and they were pretty efficient at handling those responses before the EMS actual people showed up and relieved us of our work. What they did mind, and what we saw, unfortunately, more than we should have, were a certain number of those responses really weren't warranted. In some cases, a person was all right. They just wanted to be transported to the hospital, which was not the purpose of the whole program. Certainly, you don't put someone on an engine and take them to the hospital. You'd wait for the EMS bus to come in. But there was a certain level of abuse of the system in that sense. But when it came down to actually going out, providing the first initial care, occasionally you start seeing the deaths. People were either dead when you showed up, and you had to, if a family member or a husband or someone was there, you had to be more than just a firefighter or a fire officer. You had to be someone who understood that these family members are going through a traumatic emotion here, and you got to show some kind of support to them because they just lost a loved one. So there was that aspect that you really didn't see that often in the firefighting. In firefighting, if you came across a dead body, well, you may or may not remove the body depending on the situation, but that was the end of it. You'd be back at the firehouse. Here, you were dealing with human interactions, people who were either with a family member who was quite ill, and there was the upset of that. In some cases, with a family member who was deceased, and all of a sudden their life was turned upside down. Um, so that was that added an interesting aspect to the job and the challenging aspect. Overall, it was not popular when it came in, but the guys did what they had to do. Firemen, FDNY guys are like that. At least when I was on the job, you throw them a curveball, yeah, they're going to complain, blah blah blah, but they're going to go out and do the job. And
Amen.
that's pretty much what I experienced with them.
And it's a fine line to walk in those situations where, on one hand, you're trying to compartmentalize, to where it doesn't affect you emotionally. You got to put up that wall to protect yourself. And it's the same thing when I have these conversations with cops. But at the same time, you're human. You don't want to be cruel to them in that moment. Okay, we'll deal with you in a second, man. We know your husband just died of a heart attack.
Yeah,
No, be someone who can be a comforter, but also still focus on doing your job. It's easier said than done, but I've seen it demonstrated numerous times. And it makes me just feel really proud to know so many in the fire service and police service by extension each
absolutely.
time I see it, because it's such a fine line to walk.
And you are thrust into those situations as a deputy chief. An instance that comes to mind right now, um, a fatality, a man clearly deceased in the department. I'm walking around as a deputy. You have to do an in-depth report, and I'm sketching out my scene, my diagram, and all this. As I go down back to the street to my command post, this very upset woman comes up to me and says, my husband, where's my husband? Well, I know where her husband is. He's lying down deceased right now. And yet I still am finishing up a fire. We're still overhauling. We're still doing this. I can't just turn around to her now and say, hey, lady, your husband's dead.
Mm.
So I'm in this position where I have this clearly upset lady, and I have in my mind the image of her husband deceased lying on the floor in the bathroom, and I had to gently take her aside and bring her to a police officer to go back to doing what I had to do as the incident commander of that fire. And you once in a while found yourself in these positions where you were not only a firefighter or a company officer or a chief, but someone who was dealing with, you know, human emotions, very, very understandably upset people. And, you have to, you're never going to get comfortable in that situation, but you have to be able to force yourself to act in an appropriate way.
An interesting little tidbit here, of course, you weren't in Special Operations Command yourself, but in 1998, when the squads came into existence, assuming that you were still in the Bronx at this period, you got Squad 41 and then you got Squad 61. And guys start leaving different companies within the boroughs to go there. And if you're a fire officer that's losing 2 or 3 guys from your company, or if you're a chief dealing with certain guys from critical commands that you're fond of that are leaving to go to these squads, you're happy for them, but now there's vacancies. So if you dealt with that at all when Von Essen and Downey combined for what proved to be a great decision, it is a great decision. Those squads are still going strong 25 years later. But if you were thrust into that position, how did you deal with it? Somebody can always step up, but it's a newfound problem, or not problem, I should say, but newfound test rather, to train somebody to fill that vacancy of a really good firefighter.
Well, I was a deputy, I believe, when that occurred, and I was not working in SOC, so I didn't get to a position where I was recruiting. I did not, as not a non-company officer at the time, I didn't lose personnel. I kind of saw a different side of that problem, and you're right. Eventually, that program turned out very well, and those established squads and their diversified abilities turned out to be a real resource for the job. But there was another side of that coin, at least initially. And let's say in Engine 61, which was a typical Bronx engine, not everyone who was in that engine was allowed to stay in when it became a SOC engine. For whatever reason, I don't know how these decisions were made or who made the decisions, but there was there were some hard times for some individuals who couldn't stay in those companies. And again, I was kind of removed from the situation as a deputy chief, but I could see where um, it was a generally good idea that took a toll on some individuals. There was some bitterness from some individuals who were not allowed to stay in the engines that they were assigned in, and they were replaced by people who were SOC trained or were going to be SOC trained. Again, I don't know what the parameters were or who made that particular decision, uh, but I was like this. Firefighters, we like our routines. We get used to our coworkers. We get used to our companies. There's a great deal of pride in your house, and when someone tries to disrupt that, you mentioned Commissioner Von Essen. Um, when I was a battalion chief, actually, when I was a deputy chief, he had an idea that objectively may not be a bad idea, but he decided to start moving chiefs all around the city. Okay. He decided for whatever reason, and I don't know what his reason was, that he would take a chief from Queens and put him to Manhattan, a chief from Manhattan, put him to wherever. Uh, it turned out to be a very unpopular decision. Guys liked their battalions, they liked their divisions, and when they got the call, hey, tomorrow or the day after you're being transferred to another division, um, it wasn't a popular thing. We like our routines. In my case, I got the call. I was in the third division at the time, Midtown, which I loved. I loved the third division. In fact, I was in the middle of a meeting. I had called in my battalion chiefs. It was right in the middle of this meeting. I was talking to them. I got a call from headquarters. Hey, Tom, you're going to be transferred to the first division. When? In 2 days. Okay. Uh, at that point, I didn't care about my meeting anymore. This was July of 2001. This is just before 9/11.
Mm.
And I get a call, you go into the first division. So I wasn't totally thrilled with that. I was going to go, hey, I got no choice. I'll go. I'll do my best wherever you send me. I found out that the seventh division had an opening, which was the Bronx in northern Manhattan. And I debated it. I mean, the first division was like the third. It was exciting. It was Manhattan. But I kind of had experienced the Bronx, and I felt like, geez, I want to go back to the Bronx. So I called up the then chief of operations and say, hey, listen, it's Tom Dunne. I'll go to the first division if you want, but there's an opening in the seventh. Could I go up there instead? And he said, yeah, go ahead. So 8 weeks before 9/11, rather than being assigned to the first division, I went to the seventh division. And I can't help but continually think, the fate of life. If I had not made that phone call, would I have been working in the first division on the morning of 9/11? Because I was working the morning of 9/11, but I was working in 7th Division in the Bronx. And I look back on that, I look back at my whole life and realize that I've been an incredibly blessed and lucky person. And I can't help but wonder if I had not made that phone call to operations, or if that person, the chief of operations, had not allowed me to go to the 7th, would I even be here? Or conversely, and this is a bad feeling, did my going to the 7th put someone else in that position
Mm.
on the morning of 9/11 and they disappeared? So you get all of these thoughts about, wow, how one little phone call, one little decision in life leads to subsequent ramifications. And you could get lost in these things, and you have to really step back and say, no, I'm not going to get lost in this line of thought. But once in a while, if I'm lying in bed at 2 in the morning and I wake up, these things pop into your head. But going back to your original question, yeah, the squads turned out to be a really good idea. Um, and there was some resistance by some guys because all of us like our routines, like our companies. And when you start disrupting that, firefighters are conservative people overall, and we like we like things the way they are. We really do.
And of course, and it's funny you mention that because I harken back to an interview I did last year with Tom Richardson right before he retired as chief of the department. And he was involved in those meetings too in the summer of 2001, in which he was saying he really wanted Manhattan, but Dan Nigro put him out in Queens.
Yeah.
He had the same thought process because in that same meeting was Matt Ryan, who was the chief at the time. Matt Ryan ended up getting Manhattan. Matt Ryan responded 2 months later. Matt Ryan died that day, unfortunately, in the line of duty amongst 342 of his men. So again, it's you're right. It is tough to think, wow, if I had stayed, or if I had, and there's many different scenarios with something like that. If I had ended up swapping with somebody and working that day, it sticks in your mind. Now, I have a question. It ties in perfectly to a question that somebody has in the chat. So the third division, that was Vinny Dunn's division until he retired in 1999.
Yeah.
Did you replace him when he left? And before you answer
No,
that,
absolutely not.
okay,
I didn't replace him. I don't remember exactly when he left. I was a firefighter in 24 truck when the third division was upstairs, and
okay,
Vinny Dunn was upstairs as the division commander of the third division.
okay,
And it was great, working under Vinny. I mean, I can't say enough good things about that guy. He's like, maybe the Babe Ruth of chiefs.
yeah,
He was just a great guy to be around. Two things that impressed me most about Vinny was his command presence. You'd see him in front of a major collapse or something, or the worst fire you can imagine, and he just had a certain calmness and competence that he projected. So as a firefighter officer, he was great, but as an individual, he was great. I mean, I was just a lowly firefighter, and he would talk to me. He would talk to anybody. He talked to the new probie. So he was a very personable guy. And yeah, he was there when I was a firefighter, but when I was in the third division, at that point, Vinny was probably long retired from the job. He was probably out of the job for a couple of years.
okay. All right, yeah. He ended up he was there from in the job total from 1958 until 1999. When he retired and went into the private sector. And Mike Thomas in the chat asked, "Hey Chief, I have a question. When you went to the seventh division, did you replace Joe DiBernardo? He retired in 2001."
Now, Joe was briefly in the sixth division. Again, when I was a firefighter, he wound up in the sixth division, which was the lower part of the Bronx, and he had the upper part of Harlem. So I didn't replace him. I don't know who I replaced. I don't know why there was an opening and how, perchance, luckily, I wound up there. Uh, the chief officers at the time, I'm trying to think I know the division commander was at the time, a guy named Jim Morenin. So no, Joe DiBernardo, again, a great guy, great fire officer. He was essentially, to my memory, for the most part, a chief in the sixth division.
Mm. So you mentioned you were working that morning. Of course, the call comes in over the air, 846 plane into the World Trade Center. Tell me about your route down there, and when exactly did you get down there? Prior to the collapses or afterwards?
It was afterwards.
Okay.
That was a situation where early in the morning, I came in early that day, as I always did, doing my usual morning routine with the television on in the background, watching the news, and I'm watching this thing unfold, and it's mesmerizing. It's scary. It's incredible. I didn't actually get called down there until a little after midnight,
Hmm.
maybe 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. Finally, the dispatcher decides to send myself and several other battalion chiefs from our division down there, and it was just really weird because at that point we commandeered a city bus and we flagged them down, said take us to the trade center. So here's a city bus taking me and a bunch of other battalion chiefs down to the trade center, and we didn't get down there. I didn't get down there till maybe 2:30 in the morning, and then obviously thrust into the mania of what was going on down there. But I spent a good part of that day watching this thing unfold, handling phone calls, trying to set up logistics, trying to set up pools of firefighters in different staging areas in the Bronx that we could gradually send down there. I don't know how they got the phone number because it was an interior department phone line, but I started getting phone calls from, there was a department up in Maine that said, you need help. And yeah, I said, yes, send whoever you can. If you got EMS, start sending them down. Because I thought, well, we're going to need resources here. But it was a frustrating experience because I wanted to be there. As strange as that seems, it was harder to watch it in a way. It was scarier to watch it than to actually be there. I felt if I was there, I could function. I could start sizing up.
Right.
I could do something to other than handling the logistics in these phone calls, I could deal with firefighters. I could supervise. I could do something to help.
Yeah.
And it took a while. And then when I got down there, we spent, obviously a great deal of time that night. And like everyone else, spent many, many weeks down there.
Oh, of course, and I can understand that feeling. I mean, you're trained. You can go down there and you can render medical aid because at that point, rank goes out the window. You're a firefighter. What was Ray Downey doing that day? He leading operations? Yes, but he was going out there and helping people to safety. The last time anyone saw him, he was helping a man out of the Marriott.
Yeah.
So at that point, rank goes out the window. Everyone that day, from chief to probie, was just a firefighter. So that feeling I can understand completely. This presents a unique challenge, right, in the Bronx afterwards, to where all boroughs have been hit.
Yeah.
But the Bronx is no different. So many good personnel, rather it be firefighters or fire officers, were lost in this attack. And being a chief is enough pressure as it is, but now you're trying to function without these members. You're significantly shorthanded. Now
Right.
you have guys working overtime to cover for these tremendous losses that you've suffered. Juggling that and dispersing personnel is not easy by any stretch of the imagination. But during that time frame, everybody that I ask about this talks about the teamwork that went on in the days and weeks and months afterwards. And I imagine that teamwork helped you get through a utmost trying time. Guys must have really stepped up to the plate to lighten your load.
They did. They did. It was funny. Something else happened in the at least in the Bronx, at least in my division, after several days after 9/11. It's almost like everyone realized you don't mess with the fire department now. You don't mess with the police department. There were no false alarms. There were very few runs. It's almost like the Bronx drew in, and all the nonsense runs, for some reason, just stopped. Um, we were doing everything. As time went on, you did your firefighting in the field. They set up these routines where you were sent down periodically for a 12-hour shift at the trade center. On your time off, you would sleep. You'd go to funerals. It seems like you're always doing something. For a short period of time, maybe for a week or so after 9/11, we actually had companies from suburban communities come in. We had a couple of volunteer departments come in, filling spots. Even downstairs at my firehouse, the 56 truck was down at the site. They sent a volunteer truck from, I think it was Mount Kisco, which is a town in Westchester County, a volunteer company.
Mhm.
And they responded out of our house. So it was strange. It really was strange. And obviously there was just so much to do. It seems like you were always going to work or going to the trade center site or going to a funeral. It seemed like, this endless routine, and you knew you had to do it. You didn't think about it. It went on and on for months, and um, uh, guys did incredible work down there. And not only the fire department, what the construction workers did, what the demolition workers did. The first night was an utter nightmare, but as they started to get a handle on things, as they started to get the logistics down and get the organization down, it was a beautiful thing to watch. Ironically, how much people stepped up, how well organized things got.
Mhm.
Uh, I am just so impressed with how the fire department and the city dealt with that period of time. And even for a couple of hours, Giuliani was a hero, and he's gone down the tube since then. But it was a joy to watch how the city and how the FDNY dealt with this and rebuilt itself.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And I think that I was watching. I had some time to kill the other day on one of my days off from work, and I was watching Game Five of the 2001 World Series. I'm a big Yankee fan. Not, this year has been a little bit tough on me to say the least. But in the background is Mariano Rivera's, working to get out of a jam, and he does, and eventually Yankees end up winning that game. In the stands in the first row is the family of Patrick Waters, and they're holding up his sign. And Patrick Waters was the captain. He ended up perishing that day. I believe he worked in hazmat. He's a diehard Yankee fan, and Mariano gets out of that jam, and essentially the sign read, "Do it for him."
Yeah.
And even the sports teams in the aftermath of that kind of took on that pride,
Yes.
wearing the NYPD and FDNY and Port Authority police hats. And yeah, it was great to see. Out of tragedy comes those silver linings. And strictly from an operational standpoint, the FDNY, which was already great by this point, it was tested mightily. Any agency in that situation, it's hard to criticize because nothing like that had ever happened before. But out of it came some new operational procedures that are still paying dividends to this day. And I don't know if you were working for this, but a couple years later is an uh-oh moment. But thankfully, it wasn't terrorism. But people, this is only 2 years afterwards, so people are still a little jumpy. And the anniversary just passed. Were you working for the blackout in 03?
No, I was not.
Ah, man, I wish you were, because I would have loved to ask you about this. I don't know if you responded to this either, but it did happen in the Bronx, and this is something that, as a fire officer, you have to deal with, even if you weren't there. From a strictly, we talked about earlier, providing comfort. Black Sunday, January 2005, when the fire occurs in both the Bronx and Brooklyn. Brooklyn, Richie Scolfani perishes, but in the Bronx, you got John Ballou and Kurt Myron that end up perishing in that fire. I don't know if you responded directly, but even if you didn't, tell me about the aftermath of Black Sunday, or even if you were there that day itself.
I came in. It snowed that morning, heavily. Most of the time, I would drive down to the city. That one particular day, I took the train down because of the snow. Um, my mutual partner in the fire department, you do a 24-hour tour. You have a mutual partner. He picks up your half. You pick up his half. My mutual partner had that fire. I came into work that morning. I typically would come in about 8 o'clock before the official 9 o'clock start of the tour. I must have gotten in a little before 8 at that point because I took the train. Um, they were already at that job. My mutual partner was the incident commander. My mutual partner was a great chief, a great incident commander. And I remember sitting in the office listening to what was going on there. And my aide, a firefighter, and I were looking at each other, thinking, "Oh my God, this sounds horrible." Um, I missed that fire by, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes. Um, it just was at the very tail end of his half of the tour. And again, you talk about fate. If for some reason we had reversed that mutual and I had worked the first half, I would have had that fire. He was very upset. Everyone who went to that fire was very upset by that fire, um, and he was upset. I remember I was sent over there to relieve him on the scene. It was bitterly cold that morning, and I took him aside and he filled me in on what was going on, what had happened, and he had a look in his eye of like just a devastating look. He carried that with him for some time, understandably. But that was again one of those mornings where you step back, and 95% of my time at the fire department was exciting and fun. But once in a while, you'd have that type of experience where you'd step back and think, man, we're basically in our careers threading the possibility of catastrophe, either to myself or to my employees or to the civilians. And you try to do the right thing, you try to make the right calls. But even if you do the right thing, if you make the right calls, there are going to be scenarios, as there were that morning, that are beyond your control. Stuff is going to happen that you can't change, and it's going to be emotionally devastating. And unfortunately, this is the downside of being a firefighter. Most of it is up. Most of it is adrenaline popping fun. And then you get back to the firehouse and you have even more fun. But once in a while, you're going to run into that 9/11, the terrorist attack, the Black Sunday, the fire where, for no conceivable reason, it hits the fan and it goes badly and people are going to be hurt. And that was, that was a devastating morning for our division, for the job, certainly the families involved in that. And again, I walk away, 33 years with the fire department, and I was very lucky. I was lucky as an incident commander. I was lucky as a firefighter, and it's not because I was the greatest guy on the planet. I was a pretty good firefighter, I think, pretty good officer, but I was also pretty lucky. And I give thanks for that, every day of my life.
You hear it in sports a lot. Sometimes you'd rather be lucky than good.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's what you just got to chalk it up to, that you can make that walk home or drive home at the end of the day after a tour. And I'll ask you real quick on a lighter note. This has been a great conversation thus far. Volume 42 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's lead, our guest tonight, retired FDNY Deputy Chief Tom Dunne, is that, it's really exploded now in a good way, but it's starting to around the mid-2000s with the technology being introduced to the fire service. And imagine telling a firefighter from, when you first came on in 1981, a really salty veteran back then, one day we'll have tablets. One day we'll have drones and computers helping us at these scenes. So when it was starting, and by the time you retired around 2014, 2015, it was really starting to take off. Tell me about getting used to utilizing these things that you're seeing on television, but now, hey, they can help you at a fire scene too.
Yeah, absolutely. I am all for technology, and initially, I was probably the worst technological person on the planet. I really was. I resisted having a cell phone for years. I wanted to be left alone. Uh, I guess I was old school who had to modernize. All right. A good example, there was a battalion chief in the Bronx when I was a company officer. He was like, an old salty guy. And when they first came out with computers and they gave them to battalions and said, incorporate this into your office administrative procedures, he put it in a box and kept it under his bunk. He wouldn't even take it out of the box. So we've come a very long way from that. Um, I know there's drones now. There's a lot of great technology. When I was a deputy chief, they started incorporating the electronic command board. Initially and still at times, basically, you work with a metal board where you put the magnetic markers of the companies on the board so you know where everybody is. Now they're starting they have more technology where you can pick up electronically where people are. They incorporated the pass along into a thing where if a fella's in trouble, he presses a button, it beeps all over the fireground, and on your command board, you can kind of tell at least who that person was. So they started introducing all of that stuff. And I welcomed all of it, especially as a deputy chief running a big fire. I wanted all the good input I could get. I really did. But you're right. When I came on the job, 1981, most people didn't have computers, and it came into the job very, very gradually. Um, it's a very different job today in many ways than when I came on the job. I think it's almost a more difficult job than it was because they're doing so much more. You're doing EMS work. There's a great deal of hazmat. There's a great deal of SOC type of activity. Uh, we didn't even think about terrorism back then. It wasn't a reality. So there, and the nature of the building and the construction, buildings collapse more quickly. There's more plastic. So there's a whole spectrum of things that weren't in place in 1981 that have gradually been part of our world over the subsequent decades that have made the job of a firefighter, I think, more technical, more difficult, and more dangerous. So my hat's always been off to anyone, whether you're paid or volunteer, doesn't matter. But anyone who becomes a firefighter, you're taking on an awful lot, And as one who did it a long time and was very lucky, I certainly admire anyone who steps up today and takes on this type of work. I loved it. I wish I could start again. There are times when I wish I was a firefighter again, and then there's other times when I sit back and think, nah, I did it. Now let me enjoy myself a little bit. Now I lecture, I write, I do all the things that are fun, but they don't have that adrenaline popping feeling that you had as the first new firefighter or the first new company officer at a job. That's something that I miss, but I'm glad that I had the opportunity to experience it.
James Hanlon, who has yet to appear on the show, but I do want to get him on. He directed the Naudet brothers, or had a role in directing the Naudet brothers 9/11 documentary, which was firsthand footage that they caught that day of the attack. And he was saying, when my head hits the pillow at night, still to this day, now that he's been involved in Hollywood and directed numerous things, numerous successful projects since then, he's still a New York City firefighter. It
Yeah.
never leaves you because,
Yeah.
as you said, there's nothing like it. But nevertheless, I don't want to gloss over your time as a writer and as a lecturer because I think it's important that we touch on that too. And then as we hit on that, we'll get the rapid fire because I don't want to keep you too long. But writing is one thing. I write. I have a newsletter. I often joke that podcasting is my wife, but writing is my mistress. But it's how I first started before I ever got into podcasting. And it's one thing to put a column together. It's one thing to put a blog together. It's entirely different to write a book.
Yeah.
So when did the love of writing begin for you? And when did the process of saying, at least starting it mentally, I should probably put this in the book begin for you as well?
It started gradually. I initially was writing magazine articles. I write for Fire Engineering magazine, and they've been very good to me over the last really 20 years now. I've been able to produce about 20 feature articles, and I remember the first article I intended to write. I had a good taxpayer fire in Washington Heights with a power pit collapse, and I looked at that. I even had some pictures of it, and I kicked it around and thought, geez, I remember reading these great Vinnie Dunn articles and all these great articles in Firehouse and Fire Engineering. And I thought, well, let me take the challenge at least of trying to do it. And I thought at first, how can I write 2,000 words about this? And then I did it, and I had some good photographs, and then I did it a second time. So I kind of got used to writing a 2,500 word article, a somewhat technical article for fire engineering. After a while, I didn't so much get bored with it as I wanted a different type of writing challenge. I wanted to do something that was a little more creative, a little more personal, and I always kind of toyed with the idea of writing a memoir about my experiences in New York, and I resisted that for two reasons. Number one, how do you write 85,000 words? That's like, how do you?
Nice.
It so seemed impossible. It seemed like what a challenge. And the second thing was, who the heck am I? I'm not a famous person. And what did I do that's so unique? And yet there were these experiences. I talked about a few over the course of our conversation that were in me that I guess I wanted to share. And I started playing around. That's what led to Notes from the Fireground, my FDNY memoir. I started I put it off. I actually came back from a ski trip once in February of several years ago from Vermont, and for no apparent reason, that was the day I was able to sit down at the computer and write it. I wound up finishing the book over a period of I don't know 2 years perhaps. Started looking around for publishers. Was fortunate to get it published, and then about a year or so after that, again, I'm the type of person who always wanted to try something new, and then I thought, well, I have all these images of New York City. I know New York very well. I know firefighting very well. I can envision a fiction, a story about a character that, in my mind, I started writing a novel in my mind. And again, having done the first book, it almost made it easier. Like, well, I did that book. Why don't I try another one? And what happened was during the COVID period, uh, everything slowed down. I wasn't doing as much lecturing. I was spending more time at home. I needed another challenge, and that's when I again sat down at the computer and started banging out this novel. And this was quicker because I guess maybe I was a little more efficient at writing at that point. And in about 9, 10 months, I finished the novel. Again, you go through the whole process of trying to get a publisher, and I managed to get the book published. So these were things that were kind of in me that I never sat down to be a writer. I don't consider myself a writer now. If you woke me up at 2 in the morning and said, "What are you?" I'd probably say I'm a firefighter, but a firefighter who enjoys writing and has gotten better at writing over the years. So that's kind of like where it came from. I had these memories, these experiences that I wanted to share, not only with the fire community, almost more so with the people out there who've never been to a fire, who've never been to a firefighter, who might be curious about what's life like in New York City, what's life like in the FDNY, what's it like to force a door and crawl down a hallway, all these things that I thought I wanted to share with people, and they've been pretty well, people have liked them. So, right now I still have other writing. I've started another magazine article the other day. I have two more books in my mind. It's just going to be a question of find the time and the instinct again to sit down at the computer and start them.
Isn't it therapeutic? I mean, that's what I find when I write. It's no matter what you're writing about, it's so therapeutic. You're stimulating the mind in all the right ways. It's the best mental exercise I find.
It is. It's a diversified exercise because I like physical exercise. I like physical challenges. I do carpentry work, but writing, you're right. It's a different. It must be a different slice of your mind that you're using. There's a certain fulfillment from writing that I cannot get from carpentry, that I cannot get from skiing, So I think it is a big challenge, but at the same time, it is therapeutic, and um, it's just a way of looking at the world in a concise way that it can be kind of appealing. Very frustrating because
Mm.
you knock off your 250 words, and then next morning you look at them and you think, this is horrible. I got to rewrite the whole thing. But yeah, it's a process, and it's a part of my life. As I say, it's not the lights and sirens of being a firefighter, but it's an important part of my life.
Oh, mine too. It was my first love, like I joked about earlier. And listen, I joke about it being my mistress, but the part about loving it, that's no joke. I should say, I should correct myself. So definitely still a love of mine, even after I've done 260 episodes of this podcast. And
Yeah.
the other question I wanted to ask you briefly before I hit the rapid fires, you mentioned lecturing. You did mention you on LinkedIn that you would be at FDIC, which is great. Very happy for you about that. And the room must light up, and that must in turn allow you to have even more energy, as if you don't have enough already for these presentations and excitement, seeing how much joy these younger firefighters get out of these presentations.
Oh, that's a great experience. During the COVID period, I was doing a lot of Zoom work, and I hated it. It's such a.
We
I mean,
all
no,
did.
we're doing a version of Zoom now. I realize,
Yeah.
but there is so much to be said for being in front of a live audience. And initially I had to get used to that, but now I've done that for like 15, 16 years, and you almost feel like a performer. Like you get a feeling for your audience. When they like what you're saying. You know when you say something funny that they relate to. It's like a feeling out process. You walk in the room in front, and they look at you, and you look at them, and in the first minute and a half or 2 minutes, you establish or don't establish your rapport. And it's just a great thing. It's a different type of challenge, just the way you carry yourself, how confident you are up there, how personable you can be, because everyone can do the PowerPoint, but to make yourself the focus and not the PowerPoint is the real challenge. And that's what I enjoy doing. And FDIC has been very good to me. I've been going out there, I don't know, again, 15, 16 years. Uh, Most of the time the room is pretty full, which is, I think part of that simply is FDNY. If they
Yeah.
see FDNY, they assume you're good, even if you stink, So I got that going for me. But I do get a lot of feedback from the students afterwards. They come up to talk to me, and I can sense that many of them have liked it. But it's always you're only as good as your last one. So I try to energize myself and draw lessons from the last one. What did I do well? What could I improve on? Just as I did the same thing as a firefighter and as a chief officer. All right, I did this well. What did I screw up on? And I do that now with my writing, and I do that now with my lecturing. What could have gone over a little better? Where did I start to bore them a little bit? Where were they excited? When did they laugh? That type of thing. I just love the personal interaction that goes on in the lecture room.
I feel the same way about this show. I'll go back to previous episodes and I'll say, okay, you framed the question well here. This question you didn't frame so well. You could have asked it better. And a lot of it, sometimes we're our own worst critic. Our audiences are very gracious, but sometimes we're not gracious to ourselves. But it's that constant evaluation process that keeps you honest and, allows you to focus and improve. I'm sure I'll look back at this episode and say the same thing. I did this well. I could have done this better. But that's how you continue to evolve and stay on top of your craft.
Do you rewatch your episodes? I'm curious, and kind of critique yourself.
Yeah, I will reluctantly, and I'll listen back to them too when they go out on audio. And again, I have to give myself some sort of credit. I first started this when I was 18 years old. So from 18 to now being 23 years old, I look back at those interviews and I'm like, yeah, you've definitely come a long way. But yeah, even now to make those critiques, I will go back and maybe not necessarily the whole thing, but large chunks, listen back, watch back, and see where I can go, see what I can do better.
Yeah, that's what it's all about. I found often, especially when I worked in the third division as a deputy, because that's the media focal point of the world. Very often, I'd have a job and get an interview with the various media outlets. I'd go home, and the 6 o'clock news. I'd have my 30-second tidbit and I'd look at my interview from an analytical point of view. You know, Did I say the right things? Did I say too much? Did I say too little? Did I make the eye contact with the camera? So I was finding the same thing. I was evaluating even my media performances, as brief as they were. And
Hmm.
I'm sure you probably experienced the same thing with the podcast.
Hmm. Oh yeah, for sure. And like I said, 260 episodes now. That still hasn't stopped. It'll never stop until whenever it is this podcast ends, which is not anytime soon.
Good for
So,
you. Yeah.
yeah, thank you very much. That brings us now to the rapid fire. 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. You can say pass if you would like to. Are you ready?
Sure.
First, funniest call you ever responded to.
Wow. Well, I think the Whoopi Goldberg is on that list.
I would say.
I would say maybe the funniest would be that group of folks from Nebraska that we went to when I was in 20-foot truck on Thanksgiving morning, and their stove had lit up and was smoking the apartment. And when we cleared everything out for them, they asked us how much how much we owed them. And one of the guys in my company told them $150. That those two kind of stick in my memory.
Well, I would say. Second, funniest colleagues you ever worked with. This is where you could say multiple. You don't have to say one.
Yeah. There are two guys, both named Gary. Okay.
Mm,
One of whom, unfortunately, is now deceased. I worked with them as firefighters, and they were very different guys with completely different types of sense of humor. But anytime I was working with one or both of the Garys, I was just really happy because the one Gary was just pretty much a quiet guy, but he would come out with things out of clear blue that just had me on the floor laughing. The other Gary was a big, tough, strong guy who was like had the most sharp, aggressive sense of humor. You couldn't keep up with this guy. You wouldn't want to compete with him or give him retorts. It was a pleasure just to sit in the kitchen and watch him interact. He was an insult artist, but he was a good guy. He had a warm heart, but he was just the world's greatest insult artist. And even though they shared the same name. There were very different types of guys with very different types of humor. But though, if I had to pick two guys, colleagues that were the funniest, I'd have to say my Garys were without a doubt the funniest guys.
for sure. Third, now you can elaborate earlier. You teased it. As a captain, you had a really uplifting job. What was it?
Oh, yeah, I was involved up west side of Manhattan, west 133rd Street. I can still see the building. It was a vacant tenement. We were first due. I happened to be an 80 engine that day. Uh, Gave the 1075. We went in with my man, started stretching the line into the front door, looked up the staircase. This is a 5-story tenement. I looked up. All you could see, it was like a Hollywood fire.
Hmm.
Like most fires, it's mostly smoke and no fire. This was floor after floor of fire. And I'm looking out from the lobby, and chunks of burning stuff is falling down on us. And I'm thinking, maybe we shouldn't be here. Just as I was thinking that, experienced battalion chief comes on scene. He says, 80 inch and get out of the building. Okay, that's thank God you made the call. I was on the verge of saying that. As we're heading towards the rear exit of that building, you hear this rumbling. Like it sounded like the proverbial train coming through, and all of a sudden, you no longer can see anything. It turns black. There's dust everywhere, and the building's literally collapsing around us. And I'm scared, what less at this point. And I know I got a guy in the nozzle. He's out the door, and there's another guy at the backup, and I'm not sure where he is. And part of me is saying, you got to get the heck out of here. This thing's coming down on you. Another part of me is like, I can't leave without this guy. And he apparently felt the same as I did because we can't see each other. We can't see anything, but we refuse to leave without each other. And just as my father said when I became a firefighter, just yell out, your guy or your company may be 2 feet from me and you can't see him. And that's exactly what happened. He was 2 feet to my left. I put my arm around him. He put his arm around me. All right. And then we went out together. We went out the back door, went into the back alley, and looked up and saw that a major part of maybe a third of that building had collapsed right where we were. And that's an uplifting job for two reasons. Number one, no one got hurt. But number two, that to me crystallized what this brotherhood thing is all about. You hear brotherhood, brotherhood, brotherhood. This was brotherhood in that I wasn't going to leave without him, but he wasn't going to leave without me. And we didn't even know each other. I was covering in that officer just for that one tour. There's a guy who's a complete stranger who stepped up for me, and I stepped up for him. And that's an uplifting job for that reason, because it wasn't just him, it wasn't just me, it was in us. And he felt exactly as I did, that as scared as he undoubtedly was, just as I was, he was going to wait for me and I was going to wait for him. So, a long answer to your question, but
That's
that
fine.
one kind of sticks in my mind as a very uplifting job.
Well, as it should. Even in the midst of a 1060 like that, or dare I say even a 1075, still, you don't forget that you can't leave your man behind. No man
You
left
can't
behind.
leave your brother. You can't forget the procedures, forget the morality of it, just the integrity. Your soul won't allow you to do that.
And I'm glad that that was the case for you and also the case for him. It is indeed an uplifting job, and I'm glad you shared it. Fourth, and again, you don't have to say one here because you've worked in many of the five boroughs, of course, quite a bit. Favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
You know, I would say I'm going to pick neither. I'm going to pick a pasta shop on Arthur
That's fine.
Avenue in the Bronx. There's a place called Brigatti's
Hmm.
that is they make fresh pasta. And when I worked in the Seventh Division, after almost every tour, I drove over to Arthur Avenue and got online and bought a box of their fresh raviolis. And that doesn't officially qualify as a restaurant, but they were great people and they made great pasta. So while there are a lot of great restaurants in Manhattan and on Arthur Avenue, I'm gonna have a call out for Bugatti's pasta. That may be my favorite place in the Bronx.
I might have to check it out next time I'm in the Bronx, specifically that area. And fifth and finally, let's say somebody just graduated from the academy. What advice would you give a brand spanking new FDNY firefighter?
Wow. Number one, stay in shape.
Hmm.
It is a brutally physical job. And the work isn't like this, right? The work is like this. It comes and goes. Just when you're relaxed at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, you're going to be working your butt up, maybe walking up 4 or 5 flights of stairs, forcing a door, and then your job is just beginning. So stay in shape. 50% of the fatalities are still from heart attacks. So stay in shape. Uh, Number two, stay sharp. There's just so much to learn. This you'll find that the more you know, the better firefighter you're going to be, and the better firefighter you are, the safer you're going to be, and the safer the people are around you. And the last thing is enjoy it. This is going to be a unique experience. This, regardless of who you are or what you've done in the past, this is going to be one of the outstanding experiences of your life, and it's going to go by quickly. They tell you this when you come on the job. And in my case, 33 years later, I turned around and thought, hey, they're right. You come on the job before you know it's over. So even though 20 years or 10 years or whatever you're going to do seems like a long time, savor every moment because you should enjoy it. It's going to not last forever.
Good advice. Good advice, Chief. This was excellent. Stick around. We'll say our goodbyes off the air. I plugged your website in the description of this episode as well as your LinkedIn. But besides that, of course, you have your books too. Any shout outs to anyone or anything that you'd like to give before I say goodbye to the audience?
I would just want to say hello to the many people I worked with and I worked for in the FDNY. You're great people. I got so much out of you as a firefighter and as a chief. You made my job easy. I never had a problem with a firefighter. They always stepped up for me, and I tried to be there for you. But I just want to say thank you to everyone who stepped up and helped me in my career.
Very nice. Shout out to them indeed. Thank you. Like I said, we'll say our goodbyes off the air, so stick around. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, we're trying to get her for a while, so it'll be good to have her this Friday. Formerly of New York One, she was the Brooklyn reporter for New York One for 24 years. She's currently running her own consulting company, and that is Janine Ramirez, who will join me here for episode 261 and episode 262 next Tuesday. 3 retired members of the NYPD Emergency Service Unit will be part of the panel, as will 3 retired members of the FDNY, hopefully Kevin Shea among them, as I alluded to earlier, because they all responded to the 1991 Union Square train derailment. So we're going to take a look back had that job combining two miniseries into one, The Best of the Bravest and the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit into The Best of Both Badges, to look back on a very, very chaotic job that both units did a fantastic job responding to. In the meantime, this has been volume 42 of The Best of the Bravest, interviews with the FDNY's elite. And on behalf of retired FDNY Deputy Chief Tom Dunne, I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you, Mike.